Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back for this month's Dean's Book Review. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner. My pronouns are she and hers, and I have the privilege of being the Dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And today I also have the privilege of moderating this panel, which I am very excited about. But first, as we like to do anytime that we gather, I do want to acknowledge that this land that I come to you today, which is in the Salt Lake Valley, is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshu, and Ute tribes. Here at the University of Utah, we recognize and respect the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And we want it to be more than just a statement that we read at the beginning of one of these presentations. So today I do want to acknowledge that our topic of sexual assault and sexual violence intersects quite significantly with Indian country. Dr. Sarah Deer, in her book, The Beginning and Ending of Rape, has demonstrated through significant historical research that the incidence of sexual assault and violence in Indian country and within tribal communities simply was almost non-existent prior to colonization. And today it's rampant and at horrific levels. Specifically, it's been found, quote, that in the United States, violence against Indigenous women has reached unprecedented levels on tribal lands and Alaska Native villages. More than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence, and more than 1 in 2 have experienced sexual violence. Alaska Native women continue to suffer the highest rate of forcible sexual assault and have reported rates of domestic violence up to 10 times higher than the rest of the United States. Though available data is limited, the number of missing and murdered American Indian and Alaska Native women and the lack of diligent and adequate federal response is extremely alarming to Indigenous women, tribal governments, and communities. On some reservations, Indigenous women are murdered at more than 10 times the national average. And that comes from the Indian Law Resource Center, who's been doing that work. And today, in honor of our missing and murdered Indigenous women, I'm wearing my missing and murdered jacket. You'll see the acronym MMIW, and then the red handprint. Red is thought to be the color that the spirit world can see. And so you'll oftentimes see that handprint associated. So I do want to say that here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, it's more than just a tribal acknowledgement statement. It's something that is pervasive throughout our commitment to Indian country and to these issues. It's more than just a statement. But that brings us to today's book review, which focuses on sexual violence on campus. And we're very excited to be here to talk about the book Sexual Violence on Campus: Power Conscious Approaches to Awareness, Prevention, and Response. And this book really looks at how activists have been working to call attention to the problem of campus sexual violence for decades. And in recent years, policymakers, campus administrators, and researchers have begun to make serious efforts to address this issue. And of course, this issue intersects with the law because campus administrators and staff are working within the existing legal scheme. So I think we'll be hearing a lot about the existing legal scheme as well. Despite this increase in attention, many campus leaders still struggle to effectively address campus sexual violence, often overly relying on policy to address sexual violence after it happens, rather than working to prevent it from not occurring in the first place. Rates of sexual victimization on college campuses have not changed in 60 years, highlighting the need for a change in action, training, and behavior. So I'm really happy to have our two amazing panelists here today who are going to talk about this book and more broadly about the issue as it impacts us here at the University of Utah and of course throughout the United States. We selected this book because, as you may know, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So we thought it would be really wonderful to highlight this issue within our own campus community. So we have two amazing panelists with us today. Dr. Chris Linder is the author of the book, which is lovely to have the author with us. And she is also an associate professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy and director of graduate studies within the Department of Education and Leadership Policy, as well as serving as director of the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention here at the University of Utah. I'm also pleased to welcome our second panelist today, who is Hilary White. And Hilary, in addition to being an S.J. Quinney alumna, is also crime victim advocate coordinator here with the University of Utah Police Department. So we have just an incredible wealth of knowledge in the room, as they say today. So we're going to start off with Dr. Linder, who is going to give us an overview to the book and then kind of broaden that out for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then turn that over to Hilary, who is going to expand upon it, talking about her experience with the issue of sexual violence from the legal perspective. So Dr. Linder, take it away.
Thank you, Dean Kronk Warner. I'm excited to be here with you all today. We met yesterday afternoon and talked about sort of the format for today, and they said, can you give an overview of the book? And I was like, what did I say in that book? Sometimes it's very much a part of who I am and what I do, but sometimes we kind of forget what we write. It came out in 2018, which is not that long ago, but given the state of the world for the past couple of years, it feels like ages ago. So it was really fun for me to get to go back through this and think about Dean Kronk Warner asked me to talk about, why did I even write this book? How did I approach this? That sort of thing. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And then I'm super excited to hear Hilary's stance as well. So couple of things I always think is really important to start with foundations and assumptions. I usually start with the land and labor acknowledgement, but the College of Law took care of that for us. So I'm starting instead with the foundations piece. So I identify as a queer, white, cisgender woman from a working class background. I was socialized and grew up exclusively in the United States, and I'm a secondary survivor of interpersonal violence. So I grew up in a home where lots of violence existed until I was about 13 years old, and then we left the situation. But I just think it's important to share those things. Those are identities that are really salient to me and really inform how I approach this work. You'll see there are identities missing here. So you see I don't say anything about my ability or disability identity. I don't say anything about a religious identity. It's because those pieces of who I am don't play into for me, aren't as salient or significant in the way that I view the world, which in some cases often means that we experience privilege in those identities that we don't think about very often. And I've just done a lot of work around these other pieces to really think through how being a white cisgender person informs how I approach engaging in the research related to dating and sexual violence. Another one of the assumptions I bring to this is that addressing violence is an equity issue. So often, especially among college students, we approach this issue primarily as a public health issue, and it's often associated with addressing issues related to alcohol and making better choices and those kinds of things. And certainly, as you'll hear me say multiple times during this 20 minutes, this issue is not easy to address, and it takes all the things. We have to come at it from many, many, many angles. And unfortunately, historically, the equity piece has been missing. Yes, we've talked about the experiences of cisgender straight white women. So we've really heavily focused on the gender piece, but unfortunately, we've missed a lot of the other issues around power that we will talk about a little bit today. I also approach this very much from a both and perspective. So like I was just talking about, I don't think that the public health approach is a bad approach to this issue. It just can't be the only approach. We have to come at this from multiple angles. You'll also hear me be pretty critical of college campuses in terms of our response to the issue and over relying on responding to violence after it happens. Similarly, it's a both and. We have to respond after it happens because it's still happening, and we can't put all of our resources into response. We have to figure out a way to get ahead of and interrupt the problem before it happens. Similarly, only focusing on teaching people how not to get harmed is both problematic and ineffective. So on college campuses, historically, we've spent a lot of time teaching potential victims, namely women, how not to get harmed. Carry your keys between your fingers, carry mace, never walk anywhere alone. But as we'll talk about in a few minutes, rates of violence, sexual violence on college campuses haven't changed since 1957. So if women carrying mace was the answer, we would be in a very different situation than we're in right now. I also firmly believe that people who cause harm can change. And when I say people who cause harm, I am referring to perpetrators of violence. So I believe that if we intervene with them early, when they first start to think about and start engaging in problematic behavior, ignoring people's boundaries, those sorts of things, I think we can make a huge change in this issue, especially with young people, which are a lot of the people that we're working with on our campuses. I also believe firmly that our punitive systems will not heal us. They will not bring most survivors justice, nor will they change the people engaging in harmful behavior. So there's a lot of movement on college campuses looking into restorative justice as an option for addressing relationship and sexual violence. I am hopeful about that. I am also extremely nervous about that. I'm nervous about, yet again, systems not changing and co-opting something that was very beautiful when it started. And I'm worried about us messing it up and causing more harm. And like back to the both and, we have to do something differently because, like I said, I don't believe that the punitive systems are going to heal us or bring most survivors justice. So that's the philosophical stuff. Here's the credentialing stuff. So I was a university administrator for 10 years. I directed a campus-based women's center at Colorado State University, where I also served as a victim advocate. So I have worked with and participated with victim survivors for a very long time in a number of systems. So I actually very first started out as a volunteer at a domestic violence shelter in Columbia, Missouri, where I went to court with survivors who were seeking protection orders from their abusers. And then eventually, of course, that turned into more. I'm also a higher education faculty member. Most people don't even know it's a discipline, but we actually study how college students think and work and develop and grow. And we also study campus environments. And my research interests specifically are around equity in higher education, student activism, and dating and sexual violence among college students. So the book we're talking about today is the Sexual Violence on Campus book. I also co-edited with a colleague of mine at UCLA a book called Intersections of Identities and Sexual Violence. And the purpose of that book is to really center minoritized students in the discourse about relationship and sexual violence. So that's the history. A note on language I think is important to note or to talk about early on. There are lots and lots and lots of ways to talk about this issue, which is one of the challenges we deal with. I think it's another example of a both and. I appreciate that there are lots of ways to talk about it because I think we can reach more people by using different language that appeals to them and makes sense to them in their world. And it can be very confusing because people are like, wait, what are you talking about? So when I talk about dating and sexual violence, what I'm talking about is anything sexual assault, rape, manipulation, emotional abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, stalking, and any other behavior where one person abuses power to control another person. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the abuse of power. And I also think it's important to note, especially when talking to college students, because early on, especially traditionally aged college students, that 18 to 24-year-old range, students are really developmentally wrestling with having a more complex view of the world. And we start out from a very dualistic place where things are black and white, right or wrong. And so they're really trying to put things in categories. Does this count as sexual assault? Does this count as domestic violence? And so when I talk to college students, I always like to remind them that a behavior can be harmful without being illegal. So it doesn't have to be a policy violation or a legal issue in order for it to cause harm. And in fact, I think those are the places we can intervene with students is much earlier on in this continuum of harm. So the dean asked me to talk about, why did you write this book? Excellent question. I had a lot of imposter syndrome when I first started because I was like, who am I to write this book? But someone approached me at a conference and said, we'd really like to hear from you about this. This book is part of a great debate series. So it's a very short book. It's also unfortunately very expensive because it's a UK publisher. So I don't like that part of it, but it is short and accessible. And the reason I wrote it is because I was a victim advocate for 10 years. And I eventually left being a victim advocate because I was exhausted. It is such incredibly difficult work, as Hilary knows, because she does it every day, to hear these stories day in and day out and feel like we're not making change. And then, like I've talked about before, rates of violence haven't changed since 1957. So we have a long history of this being a problem. The other reason is what I talked about earlier, is that sexual violence is wound with all forms of oppression. And Dean Kronk Warner talked about this in the beginning when she was talking about how Indigenous women are targeted at even higher rates than other women. We also know that on college campuses, so among college students in particular, perpetrators target gay men, transgender people, multiracial women, Indigenous women, and people with disabilities at even higher rates than their peers. So when we hear that 1 in 4 statistic that we often hear on college campuses, that's actually for cisgender straight white women. Other groups of people experience even higher rates than violence. I've said the word rate twice, and I like to always clarify this for folks. So there's a difference between rates of violence and reports of violence. So rates of violence are generated through anonymous survey research. The University of Utah participates in this every other year. There's an AAU survey that asks students to anonymously share if they have experienced particular behaviors. So the survey doesn't say, have you been sexually assaulted? It says something like, has anyone ever forced you to have sex when you were too drunk to consent? Or it gives very specific behaviors, coercive behaviors, so that people, because we know that some people don't call what happened to them violence because that word doesn't resonate with them. But when we ask behaviors, then we have a different picture of what's actually happening. Whereas a report of violence, those numbers are when a victim actually notifies an authority who notes it in official university processes. So we are hearing a lot about Clery right now. And those are examples of actual reports, which means that a person actually goes forward and tells someone with authority, this happened to me. Sometimes they want to do something about it, sometimes they don't. So rates are much higher, but they're also much more accurate because so few people actually make a report when they experience violence. So I just think that's important to note. I also will just note here very quickly, I want this loud and clear on the record. I tell my friends with children about to go to college, they actually want to send them to a college with high reports of violence because this is happening across the country. There is no campus that is immune to this. And if campuses have high reports, that means the students on that campus feel comfortable going forward and talking to somebody about what happened to them. So I think there's a big misperception. People are afraid of these high numbers of reports, but what we should be afraid of are the high rates of violence, and be grateful when our reports are getting close to matching the rates of violence that we have. Another reason I wrote this book is because the vast majority of research focuses on victimization risk factors and not perpetration. I did a study with some colleagues several years ago, and we're redoing this study now with the most recent 5 years worth of research. And this was very intentionally focused on campus-based sexual assault. But we looked at the research done over a 10-year period, and you can see here that almost half of the research focused on something related to victimization, and about 10% of the research focused on perpetration risk factors. So again, the argument that we are over focusing on teaching people how not to be victimized, and also the other challenge with this is that the number one factor for being a potential victim is being a prior victim. So we're in this circular argument. We don't actually have much solid information on what makes someone at risk for being a victim, because it's not about the victim, it's about the perpetrator. It's about what makes someone at risk for causing harm. And so that's what we want to explore more of. So all of that is some background that led to this book really operates. So this is a framework that I developed for the purposes of having the conversation about how to better address sexual violence on college campuses. This is called the Power Conscious Framework. The first three tenets of the framework are rooted in individual level behaviors, whereas the last three really look at systematic issues. The foundation at the bottom, you can see the three pieces of the foundation are that power is everywhere, power and identity are inextricably linked, and identity is socially constructed. So you can see that we come at this very much from an identity and power, the relationship between those pieces. I've started to change this is an example of evolution of research and thinking. Since writing this book, I've actually started to change my language and move away from the identity conversation and really focus on power and oppression. Because when we talk about identity, it unintentionally sends the message that individual people are responsible, when what we're really talking about are the systems pieces. But the Power Conscious framework starts out by saying that in order to engage in this work, we have to be self-aware, we have to know who we are, what we bring to the space, and we have to understand our context in history. So I think this is really, really important when we're talking about college students and violence, because so often, I mean, I even read it in articles, people will say, in the 1970s, feminists started paying attention to sexual violence, and that is just plain false. As Dean Kronk Warner pointed out, Sarah Deer has been writing about this for decades and has pointed out that Indigenous women have been engaging in activism and trying to address this issue for a very long time, because sexual violence was so much a part of colonization and so much of the way that the white folks stole the land from Indigenous people, that Indigenous people just didn't sit around and let it happen, right? Like, there was engagement around how do we make this stop. Similarly, when we look at the history of enslaved people in this country, there was a lot of activism there too, because people who were enslaving people, so white men who were owned people for the purposes of free labor, their labor supply increased when their enslaved people became pregnant, had more children. All of that just increased the property of the slavers during that time. And so by us understanding that history, it's really important to point out this isn't something that started happening in the 1970s when more women came to campus and started drinking more, which is the narrative that gets told on college campuses. So understanding that history is important, reflecting on our own behavior and how that shows up in these systems. Those are the first three tenets. The second three tenets really challenge us to better understand our own investments in systems of domination and to note where it's playing out in the culture around us. So we are very invested in policy and traditional responses to this issue. Primarily, we see this showing up in around Title IX issues, but guess what? The people that the law was written for are pretty white, cisgender, straight women who are used to things working for us, right? So those are the people that benefit, and we don't even benefit that much, but we're more likely to benefit from these systems than other folks. And then, of course, understanding the role of power in all of those. And then finally, working in solidarity together. So instead of separating these movements out and deciding who gets to do what, really figuring out ways to work together is the final part of the framework. If I had to say what the purpose of the framework was in one sentence, it would be shifting the conversation from fixing minoritized groups to holding people with power accountable for changing their behaviors. So that's really the gist of it, is turning power on its head and really making sure that we're talking about who's responsible. So then the second part of the book about awareness, prevention, and response, I think we don't often talk about these as three different things on college campuses. I think we often think that we're all of it prevention. We're trying to make it stop, which is true. We are trying to make it stop. And you can see that these circles overlap each other. So there are lots of ways that they intersect. But unfortunately, we spend the vast majority of our time on college campus responding to violence after it happens. There are two actually law review articles, which I have been using for decades, not decades, years, long before I prepared for this presentation. So, but both of these articles argue that Title IX is actually hurting us more than it's helping us around this issue, often because it's over-regulating and there are too many people involved with an issue that people who have been on college campuses have been trained to deal with for quite some time. And also this author argues that it incentivizes the post-assault focus because we only get in trouble if we have a bad response. There's no nothing out there holding us accountable for the ineffective efforts to reduce it in the first place. So it's particularly challenging. Here's an example of what I think it actually looks like at our campuses. We do most response, some awareness, and very, very little prevention. And so just briefly, because I want to be mindful of the time, that's why we started the Center for Violence Prevention at the University of Utah. The purpose of the center, the mission of the center is to use a power conscious and intersectional framework to bridge the gap between research and practice by bringing together the expertise of researchers, prevention educators, and students to execute a comprehensive research and practice agenda focused on primary prevention. So primary prevention means stopping violence before it starts. So I could, of course, talk all day about what that looks like, but we'll stop there for now. And then I'm excited to hear from Hilary, and then we'll just keep engaging in the conversation.
Thanks, Chris. I don't necessarily have a lot of organized thoughts other than I have so many reactions after reading your book. And I think as long as I've been in the field, I definitely was still learning things as I read through this book, and it helped me synthesize more of my own thoughts about going through processes with, because I work with victims directly, supporting them through different processes, including the Title IX process at the university and the criminal justice process and civil processes such as getting a protection order if that's something that they want. So I guess the first thing I want to think about is Clery and the different requirements that Clery brought about for universities. The federal regulations require a lot of different things, and some of them I find to be very problematic. So at the university, we have to issue like timely warnings is what they're called when the university or the police learn about a crime that's happened and they don't know who the perpetrator was. So it's a timely warning in that it warns the community that there's someone out here that's has committed a crime or committed some kind of harm and can be a danger to the community. But the only time that those timely warnings are issued are when we don't know who the perpetrator is. That doesn't necessarily mean that the victim doesn't know who the perpetrator is. It could just mean that the victim went in for a code R. The code R process requires a police case number, and then that prompts a police response. So the police now know that a sexual assault has happened, but police don't know who the perpetrator is, even though the victim might know and is just not ready to report at this time or willing at any time. So then they have to issue a timely warning, even though this person may not pose a larger threat to the community. Whereas in the same situation, if a victim gives up the name of the perpetrator, there's no timely issue or timely warning issued. So it actually decenters the voice of the victim and what they want to happen. I think there are cases when a timely warning is absolutely appropriate. Thinking of maybe like when the victim doesn't actually know who the perpetrator is, and that this person could be on a serial like strangling spree or something like that. I think that it can and should be issued at some certain times, but the place where Clery has I don't necessarily want to say got it wrong, because I think a lot of good things did come from Clery, but just a little thing that could be improved would be that. in centering the voice of the victim. One good thing that I didn't realize had come from Cleary is that universities used to require victims to sign non-disclosure agreements so that they couldn't actually go out and tell their stories, to protect the confidentiality and the privacy of really the perpetrator, the person who committed the harm, as well as possibly the university. And Cleary made that not okay. So it was never okay. The Cleary made that illegal, right? So if anybody does have a copy of Chris's book, it is amazing, and I do recommend it. So if you if you have a copy with you, it's on page 64. It's from the nonprofit organization that supported Cleary. It says the SOC, on page 64, SOC successfully argued that a student's right to know about the crime on their campuses superseded the perpetrator's right to privacy, resulting in non-disclosure statements becoming illegal. And it's sort of that premise throughout this book, and especially brought up in the foreword, is what is legal? What do universities and society need to be doing to avoid liability? And what is actually the right thing to do? And frequently those things don't line up, right? What can we be doing that is above and beyond what the law requires us to do? And so Cleary, I think, brought that standard to the law. Let's support the victim and let them use their voice for what they wanted to do. So the good and the bad. I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that, Chris, before I move on?
Yeah, I again, it's the both and thing. I think you're absolutely right. And I think the other thing that comes up for me frequently around this is that these laws are really well intended and end up having some unintentional consequences. And we also see this with VAWA, which is not directly related to college campuses, except for it gave all the money to the Violence Against Women grants that campuses get. It's less directly related than Title IX and Cleary, but all three are examples of extremely well-intended laws that the ways that they are currently being interpreted are having some unintended consequences that I think students aren't always cognizant of. The other thing that's coming up for me a lot around this issue is that the student activists who are the most vocal are very focused on punitive response measures. And what's interesting to me about that is that when I was a victim advocate, and I don't know how this resonates with you or not, Hilary, but we were victim advocates in different places. Like I was a confidential victim advocate in the role that I was in. And the vast majority of survivors that I sat with said, I don't want them to get in trouble. I just want them to stop. And so that's why they weren't going forward. It wasn't because like there's this master narrative that the people who work in OEO are mean and they don't get it, and the police are terrible and they don't get it. And sometimes that could be true on individual levels. Like I agree, I know that individual people have experienced harm in those spaces, but from my experience, the vast majority of the reasons why people don't go forward is because those systems don't provide the outcome that they're looking for as of right now. And so that's one of the pieces I worry about with student activists right now is it's not listening to some of their peers who are actually saying, wait, that's not what I want. And so I worry about what that means. How do we have a more complex answer to this very complex problem?
Yeah, I think that that's definitely true in my experience. A lot of times when people don't want to move forward with the criminal justice process or the Office of Equal Opportunity process, it's because they don't want that person, like they don't want to ruin the other person's life, which it's not going to ruin their life. And if it does, it's like a consequence of their own actions. So just to like put that disclaimer out there, but also like the voice of the person who has been harmed is the most important voice, right? That person's opinion and what they want to happen is the most important thing for me to be supporting. And usually it is, I don't necessarily want the perpetrator to be expelled from school. I just don't want him to do it anymore. And I don't want to have to be the one to tell him that, right? So it's also a burden to go through these different processes, and it's a burden. It's a burden to tell the victim, well, if you don't come forward, we can't do anything about it. I agree with all of that. All of that's still true. And definitely true at our institution. And I think I would say that our Title IX and OAO office does an amazing job of being as trauma informed as the system or as the process allows them to be, right? Because they have to abide by the federal laws that govern what they do and what their processes have to look like. And they do an amazing job of being as trauma informed as they possibly can. So I can at least vouch for that. And the police at the university specifically take sexual assault and interpersonal crimes extremely seriously, and also to acknowledge that that certainly wasn't always true for, I don't know that it wasn't always true for everyone that worked at the department, but there were certain folks who created a culture in the department that, you know, allowed the case of Lauren McCluskey to slip through the cracks, and the worst thing happened. So there's been a lot of work done in the years since that tragic incident that has helped people and helped the police and the administration to really understand and recognize the problems and get rid of the folks who maybe shouldn't have been here to begin with, and bring in really high quality officers to do the investigations. That's not necessarily to say that they always understand all the power and privilege involved, but they definitely understand the safety and the importance of supporting the victim through what the victim wants to do. So I do want to sort of put that out there. Not that criminal justice systems are perfect, because they are harmful. I don't think that the criminal justice system was really designed for anybody. It wasn't designed for perpetrators. It wasn't designed for victims. It's really harmful and time consuming, and it takes a lot of energy and money and everything else. And it's a system that we have, right? So it's a system that we have to figure out how to function in. And for some, I'm going to say survivors now, but in my realm, they're technically victims. Like, that's the technical term. But for some survivors, that is a mode of healing, and that's when I support them moving forward, right? But that's what we have. So just to name that. Okay, so I guess moving on.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I wasn't sure if you were done and you wanted to open it up to question and answers, or if you wanted to continue on.
I think one other thing that I do want to bring up, I appreciate that Chris had mentioned that her language is shifting to oppression over identities. And I had thought about how identity is, let me find the page because I wrote some notes here. Identity is so important. Identity work is so important. Understanding one's own identity is so important for every person on the planet. So I'm thinking about how privilege itself is not a bad thing, right? For an individual person to have privilege, I have a lot of privilege as an able-bodied white woman. I have a lot of privilege, and that's not a bad thing, right? Each person has some kind of privilege. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're evil or lazy or you didn't have to work to earn whatever you have in life, right? It matters what you do with that privilege. Privilege itself is a neutral thing. It came from oppression and not so great things. So maybe the fruit of an evil tree, but you have it, and so you've got to do the best you can with it. So I was thinking about this, privilege is neutral and it matters what you do with it. And in response, and I was thinking of like synthesizing my thoughts around the response to the MeToo movement was not all men, right? Everybody heard about the not all men rally cry in response, and that's the backlash. Like, you have to expect that backlash when people of power are being called to task. And And I just want to say, like, don't be so defensive. It's okay. Like, we're not saying all men, right? And everybody knows that. But like to take it away from men and people, really, like if I'm using an analogy here. So this actually came from a TikToker, and I wish I had access to that TikTok that I had seen. So if you all recognize it, I hope that the credit is given where it's due. It didn't come from my original thoughts. But it was the point of view of someone who's discussing gun safety. And in gun safety, your general rule is you treat every gun like it's loaded. And sexual assault safety is we have to treat every possible perpetrator like they're a possible perpetrator, even if we don't know who they are, right? So it's not a reflection on every man that like we have to call out people of power or privilege or that like the potential for harm to be done. It's just that we have to do what we can to create safety, and that's like the general rule for gun safety. So I just was thinking about how like treating it as a neutral. We have to address power. We have to address privilege because it is a neutral thing, and we have to do that because it's the right thing to do. Just like we have to treat every gun like it's loaded because it's the right thing to do for safety reasons. Okay, Elizabeth, I think that's like the big thing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I really enjoyed that conversation and presentations and learned so much. So big thank you to our speakers. So we have about 18 minutes left. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that there is a place for you. There's the Q&A function where you can enter in your questions. And so if you do have any questions for our speakers, please go ahead and enter those into the Q&A function, and then I'll go ahead and moderate that. But my first question is, if I find, Dr. Linder, your point that things haven't changed since 1957 to be disheartening. But yet Hilary told us about some of the changes that are happening here at the University of Utah. So my question is there anything happening that gives you hope that this potentially could get better?
Yes, current college students are happening. So for me, I think, again, the both and approach, and that the response pieces and improving the response pieces are really important. So the strides the university has made around hiring a chief safety officer, doing more intentional training with police officers, all of those kinds of things I do think are really important. And I think what the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention is trying to add to that work is more, what I say we focus on at the center is long-term education and research. And so long-term education means that we don't do any training. So in my mind, the difference between training and education is that training is a step-by-step, here's what you need to know to do X. So for example, as a faculty member, I need training on how to enter my grades. I need somebody to make me a video or some screenshots that says you click on this and you click on this, and then they put your grades in here, and then you click submit, right? Like that's training. To me, education means that we're helping people think differently about an issue and think about how it's showing up in their own lives and what their response to that issue is. And so in educating students, I think that we have to, I think the other misperception is that college students aren't ready to talk about this. Or the other thing I hear so often is, well, we're in Utah and the sex ed here is terrible. Friends, the sex ed across the United States is terrible. It's not unique to Utah. I know we have a unique culture here. I came from the University of Georgia prior to being here, and we had the same issues in Georgia, right? Like it's just happening across the country, and that we're afraid to talk to our kids about sex. And so yes, and our students are in a different place than many of us as quote grown-ups think that they are, and they really want to have these in-depth conversations with each other. And so for me, that's what we mean by long-term education, is like going in, being with them. And at the center, we have 10 student staff now starting in fall, which I'm super excited about. But those students, we are doing like a long-term curriculum with them. They're basically going to be taking a class the whole semester that they work there, getting the in-depth command of understanding of what the issues are, what does it mean to cause harm, how do we intervene with people who cause harm, all of those things. And then they infiltrate their own communities and do it more from a subliminal place rather than a come to this workshop and we're going to tell you what you should do kind of thing. So for me, that's what gives me hope, is that there are so many students who want to do this and want to engage deeply. And we're already seeing it, I think we see it around issues of gender. I have so many friends with teenage children and none of them identify as he or she. They're all they now. So I just am so grateful that like we're getting a whole new generation of people who are like, no, let's throw that stuff out. That doesn't apply to me. And it's much more nuanced. It's much more complicated than that. And so that's what gives me hope.
Hilary, anything you're seeing in your area that gives you hope for the future?
I echo Chris's sentiments, and I also have hope for restorative justice practices. I know that Chris had expressed some anxiety, nervousness around really doing justice to implementing such practices, but I think with the proper training and dedication to correct implementation, I think restorative justice practices within maybe the Office of the Dean of Students or the OEO would be, and I think that I think both offices have maybe long-term aspirations. I don't know exactly where they are in planning or implementation in either of those regards, but I think that would be a really good place for healing for victims, survivors, as well as perpetrators for that secondary and tertiary prevention piece. I think would be really awesome. And I think it could also be good for primary prevention and that it doesn't stop this individual perpetrator from doing harm to begin with, but the more restorative justice practices are practiced within a system, the education around that sort of spreads through the community. And I think that could be primary, like a form of primary prevention. So I think that would be amazing. It gives me some hope. And I think I have a lot of hope in the youth and the teens and the current college students already. I think that there's so many amazing things happening.
Okay. So we have a question here for Dr. Linder. You mentioned attention on the perpetrator. What needs to be done regarding an abuser?
Yeah, this is the $1 million question. And this is what I think there's a big difference between college students and other folks, at least traditionally aged college students. Because like I was talking about before, traditionally aged college students are in this developmental stage where they're figuring out what kinds of relationship they want to be in. They're figuring out who they want to be for the rest of their lives. And the current structure, the current programming we have for addressing, quote, abusers is primarily anger management kinds of workshops. It's very geared towards heterosexual, married, domestic partners. So we do know that it does exist, but most of it doesn't work with college students because they don't live with the person that they're causing harm to. They're often, now clearly we've seen too many extreme cases at the University of Utah where I'm not talking about the Melvin Rowlands of the world or the person who just murdered Chi Dong this past semester. I'm not talking about them. I do believe they need a way different kind of intervention. But when I talk about intervening with college students, what I'm talking about is the early on stuff when they're abusing, when they're ignoring boundaries from their partners, or from even not even their partners, just people they're hanging out with, like ignoring boundaries, those sorts of things, that's when we can intervene. And so a couple of ways that we're trying to approach this. One is that a group of the students we hired 4 content creators, and they are awesome. They have been engaging in a 6-week curriculum to really try and understand what harmful behavior is. And now they're developing educational programs that are sort of subliminal. So they're creating a TikTok account that's called Dating with Degrees. And they're creating all of these different TikToks. My language around it is even terrible because I'm not a big TikToker. But they have specific posts that they're doing. And then they also created this like mini documentary series where they're illustrating someone engaging in bad behavior and then the person's response to that bad behavior. So it's a simulated Tinder experience. But what's also so cool about it is there's apparently this Instagram account, I hate the name of it, but it's called Utah Chicks. But every Tuesday, this Instagram account posts bad experiences on Tinder. And so these student staff are taking those examples of those bad experiences and turning it into education and saying, this is what you should not do because you're hurting people when you do this. And this is what you can say instead, right? So it's that sort of intervening before the harm ever happens. But when they're just exploring, how do I want to show up in this relationship? So that's one piece. The other piece is what Hilary was talking about with the secondary and tertiary piece. So when students have been accused or even found responsible through like an OEO process or a student conduct process for low level offenses. So I'm talking about violating boundaries. So ignoring people saying, stop texting me, stop calling me, those sorts of things. If we can intervene with those students or do education with them as part of their sanction for that in a non-shameful way, our hope is that we can intervene and stop them from going further in those behaviors and continuing to cause harm with their peers. So those are a couple of examples.
Wonderful, thank you. And for both of you, we received a question about the importance of prevention. And I think this builds a little bit, Dr. Linder, on what you were just talking about in terms of what the students are doing in educational pieces. But could you maybe expand upon that for both of you? And what do you view as the key components of prevention education?
I'll just add quickly one more thing that I would say is starting even younger with our kids and our just young people that we have relationships with. I don't have children of my own, but I interact with a lot of kids through various relationships. And a couple of things that come to mind immediately is, so one is making sure that we respect their boundaries always, always, always. I know that's tension as a parent because they have to brush their teeth, right? Like that's not a boundary that you're gonna respect. But when it comes to like my niece, okay, Aunt Chris is leaving, go give her a hug, and she doesn't want to give me a hug, she doesn't have to give me a hug, right? So being mindful of those kinds of boundaries, I think, is really important. The other thing, as kids get older, I think the thing we're hearing from college students over and over again is that all their sex ed, whether from their parents or their schools or whatever, is don't. And instead of that, a lot of folks are starting to argue. We had the authors of the book Sexual Citizens on campus in January, and they argue that one of the best things we can do is teach young people about positive sex. So how do we help them talk about what they want, what feels good to them, what are they wanting in relationships? So then it's not all about no, 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 but instead of it being no, 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 it's that this is what I want, this is what I'm asking for, this is what I need, and learning how to respect each other's needs. And then the other thing that we're hearing from our students now are that even though queer and trans students experience exceptionally high rates of violence, they also tend to be much more in tune with consent because they haven't gotten the master narratives about what a relationship should look like to them. Unfortunately, they don't get any messages about what a relationship should look like because it's been so shameful to be a queer person in our culture. There has historically been very little by way of like, what does a queer relationship look like? And so some folks are arguing that queer students have had to figure it out on their own, which in some cases is not good because there's lots of stumbling around, but in other cases it's really positive because they've had to talk about things in the way that straight students haven't had to talk about things. And so understanding consent and negotiating consent has a more positive feeling to it because of that need to communicate in a different way.
Elizabeth, I am so sorry. There was an announcement that was way too loud for me to really hear. The question I did hear was about prevention, but I was wondering if you could just repeat the question, please.
Yeah, basically asking for some thoughts on how we might improve upon what we're currently doing for prevention purposes.
Yeah, I think Chris's answer, I think, covered a lot of it. And I think I would definitely bring up also that identity work. Like, everybody needs to do the identity work to understand what power do they hold when they enter a room, when they're interacting with another person. I think that's really important. And not only like what power do you have, but what are you going to do to make sure that you're practicing equity? Like, how are you going to make another person have the same level of power as you? And that's never possible, right? But like, for example, I always, when I'm in the room with multiple folks, I try my hardest to make sure I'm not interrupting, especially another woman or a woman of color. But people do that. People just interrupt and don't really think about it. So it's really important to do those little minute things, so that you have this practice already built up. You have a foundation and a base to go from when you're having those really critical, intimate moments. And also everything that Chris said.
So it sounds like working on building those skills in general, skills of respect and respecting boundaries and being willing to have these conversations and having them in a positive space could help quite a bit. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I want to thank our panelists again for this great discussion and dialogue. I know I certainly learned a lot. There's a lot to work on, but perhaps there's a little bit of hope. And again, just by way of reminder, our book was Sexual Violence on Campus, Power Conscious Approaches to Aware, Prevent, and Response. And so we really enjoyed reading that. We're going to be on pause for May. We'll refer you back to our Leary lecture, which focused on anti-Asian violence and hate. And then stay tuned for June for Pride Month and for Juneteenth. We'll look forward to seeing you then. And have a wonderful day, everyone. We really appreciate you, and thanks for starting your day with us. Thanks so much.